Welcome, everyone. My name is Dana White. This is the Myth Salon. Today, we have Dr. Vorris Nunley with us. And as is my practice during this time of the coronavirus pandemic, I just want to let you know that nothing is going away anytime soon. And this is terribly, terribly sad. We're flirting with 15 million cases in the United States, 280,000 deaths. Each one of these represents a family member, a neighbor, a friend, somebody down the street, somebody you might know, somebody you've seen in the culture. It is just the worst situation, and I urge everyone to take it seriously and do your best so that we don't, any of us, become a statistic. So before I get it really going, what I'd like to do is open the Myth Salon with a moment of silence. And let's bring all of those who need and can benefit from the healing power of thought and prayer into the Myth Salon and send our best wishes to them. Some of you know that I have begun a collaborative project with the most wonderful man named Jonathan Staggers to bring the 81 verses of the Tao Te Ching into production that will ultimately lead to producing a book after them. And today being what it is, instead of a poem, I thought I would read you number 22. So if you'll bear with me, eventually you'll get to hear Jonathan read it, but today you get me. Forget knowing where you are going. Be here now. Give way to conquer the elements. Adapt, bend, yield. Mold yourself to circumstances. Empty every cavern inside you to achieve fullness. Exhaust yourself to find renewal. Seeking solidarity will weigh you down. Stop possessing, reduce, unburden, become your essence. Surrender to everything, and everything becomes available. Holding anything gives power to what you hold. Too much causes confusion, disrupts balance. Attachments murder clarity. If you seek wholeness, let yourself come apart. To be straight, learn the arts of flexibility. If you want things to come to you, let everything go. To be reborn, die. The sage approaches existence armed with emptiness. He serves the Tao because he sees what can be done. Because he stays out of his own way, what to do becomes clear. He never needs to show a compass or prove anything. Without goals clouding his mind, every path holds success. He earns trust by cultivating virtue in the community. His words are precise. People listen. Without self-reference, people see themselves in him. By following, the sage is always in command. Because he does not talk about himself, he is appreciated, gathering respect. Making people feel honored by who they are. He gives no thought to merit, to status, or to claim. By serving as an instrument of the Tao, the sage lives true to himself, ready to turn one leaf over to reveal another, moving fluently through the interplay of light and shadow as the birth and passing of the Tao expressing itself. So with just a moment, Will, why don't you introduce the panel? And let's get ready for a wonderful evening with my good friend, Vorris. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dana. Such a pleasure to be hosting this event with you and Vorris tonight. Hard to believe it's only been a couple years since that Jungian certification program in the Joseph Campbell Writers Room. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you to Vorris for contributing to the Myth Salon as a panelist, I believe for every salon during this crazy 2020. That so many, I mean, I'm seeing a pretty full house tonight, so I have a feeling that most people that have been here for most of those events are here tonight. So, you know, feel free to text into the chat. Thank you to Vorris as well. Tonight's topic on embracing the heretical and reclaiming the repressed and oppressed dark and feminine is a truly perfect punctuation to the year of salons that we've had, to this 2020. Next time, as you know, will be a community event on Christmas. So I hope you all will come with thoughts to share around Christmas in 2020. But Vorris is our last speaker for the year. And as you draw from the first couple, as Vorris draws from the first couple, Adam and Eve, to discuss our present humanity, I hope we'll all reflect on 2020 with eyes to the future. So to thank all the panelists for joining. You all know Dr. Dana White, scholar, author, host of This Myth Salon, and adjunct faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute. My name is Will Linn. I lightly moderate these myth salons with my PhDs in myth and depth psychology. I've spent years working for the Joseph Campbell Foundation and building an academic department for filmmakers and performing artists at a place called Husson College. We're also joined by Dr. Dennis Patrick Slattery, a mythology scholar, poet, longtime professor in Pacifica's Myth program, and author of a book I happen to have on my desk, An Obscure Order, Reflections on Cultural Mythologies. We're also joined by Selina Matthews, who's a clinical psychologist, author, and keynote speaker who's graduated from Pacifica and has been an ever-present participant as well. Thank you, Selina, also for being at all of these 2020 salons. And with us tonight is Kelly Carlin, founder of Women on the Verge, a year-long coaching program for women that marries depth psychology and midlife transition. She's author of The Carlin Home Companion, Growing Up with George, host of Sirius XM radio show, The Kelly Carlin Show, and the podcast, Waking from the American Dream. Kelly holds a master's in counseling psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. Many of you will remember Loralee Scott, who presented with us in the past, who is the founder and director of the Sophia Center for Transformative Learning and a former executive director of the Assisi Institute, where she designed, developed, and delivered educational courses and conferences focused on a psychoanalytical understanding of creativity, trauma, and identity for professionals from around the world. And thank you also for joining me at Husson for that crucial meeting. That was really cool. And Dr. Elizabeth Eowyn Nelson, a professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where she's been teaching since 2003. Her books include The Art of Inquiry, A Depth Psychological Perspective, which she co-authored with Joseph Coppin and is now in his third edition. Psyche's Knife, which I was told all about by Dennis when I was finishing my coursework. Psyche's Knife, Archetypal Explorations of Love and Power, and the forthcoming Shadow Vows and Love, Work in the Art of Life. She coaches individual artists and authors, guiding writers from inspiration to publication. And we're also joined by Dr. Zaman Stanizai, professor of mythology and political science at Pacifica and Cal State, a poet, linguist, mystic, and Fulbright scholar. Thank you, Zaman, also for being with us for all of these 2020 salons. And of course, I forgot to mention that gratitude to Dennis as well, who's been here with us for all of these. Really incredible, and also gave a series of talks. And so hopefully we'll take some time in the Christmas event to really thank everybody for their contributions. And lastly, the man of the hour, it's my honor and pleasure to invite Dr. Vorris Nunley into the room with us tonight, who is a professor at the University of California, Riverside. He teaches rhetoric, philosophy, and literature. He's interested in issues of the heretical energy, the dark feminine, gendered and racialized knowledge, and the demise of vulnerability. His most recent presentation was a Sophia Center seminar on the monstrous, women, and meta-narrative, where he addressed the Adam and Eve myth in contemporary culture. His most recent article, is Adrift in Precarity, the Post-Family in a Neoliberal Era. Thank you, Vorris. Really looking forward to the event tonight and looking forward to bringing everybody in for a rich conversation.
Here we go.
Thank you for the introduction, everyone. I really appreciate it. Before I get started, I want to thank the panel who've been very supportive of me, who I think listened very well to what I have to say and make me feel genuinely supported. And so I really appreciate it. I want to thank all of you for showing up during this pandemic. Folks have better things to do, so I appreciate your being here. I don't take that for granted. I'd also like to thank Will, because when I first attended the Jungian seminar, he was kind of the head of it, and he was always open to listening to me and asking me questions, et cetera, and allowing me to ask him questions. So that was great. I want to thank Dr. Elizabeth Nelson and Loralee Scott. Loralee, of course, has already been mentioned, allowed me to speak at her seminar. And I was like the only male who spoke, but yet I always felt accepted and listened to. I want to thank Dr. Elizabeth Nelson, because we've had a lot of back and forth. So both of them are informing what I have to say tonight. And finally, I want to thank Dana. And some of you, particularly in an era where folks are talking about anti-Blackness, people like Dana make it difficult for other folk. Because when I first met him, we started talking. I wouldn't even be here had he not invited me to this. And when some folks who are not African-American or white or otherwise seem to not get it, Dana makes it tough on folks like that, because Dana and I don't agree on everything. We talk, we eat together, et cetera, and he's accepted me as a full human being. So Dana, I really appreciate that. You're kind of a model how other people can be in this world. So I very, very, very much appreciate it. I don't take it for granted. Okay, everyone, so let's get started. Dana, can we switch to my screen share, please?
Look at Miss Ohio, she's running around with her rag top down. She says, I want to do right, but not right now. I'm gonna drive to Atlanta and live out this fantasy of running around with a rag top down. Yeah, I wanna do right, but not right now. Had your arm around his shoulder, a regimental soldier, and Mama starts pushing that wedding gown. Yeah, you wanna do right, but not right now. Oh, me, oh my, oh, would you look at Miss Ohio? She's running around with a rag top down. She says, I want to do right, but not right now. wanna do right, but not right now. Oh, me, oh my, oh, look at me so high, oh. She's running around with a rag top down. She says I wanna do right, but not right now. Oh, I want to do right, but not right now.
I've done enough of these talks, these presentations to present and give a presentation that I know everyone would like. And that's what I had planned to do until about 4 days ago. I was listening to, at the Salon Institute, Satya Doyle Bayak. And one of the maxims they have there is socially relevant psychology, and that the intellect and intimacy are not separate, that they're connected. And I heard her during a talk with Dr. Kwame Scruggs. And she talked about the notion that she was tired of going to academic and professional presentations where everything went nice and easy because our intellects were disconnected from our bodies, right? In the conversations. And as a rhetorician, embodiment and being connected is vitally important. She said that what she wanted were presentations that had blood in the water. And so that's what I want to attempt to do here, because if we go all the way back to Plato, Plato, he argued that there is no learning without unlearning, and there is no unlearning without discomfort. So instead of going for the perfect presentation, I want to have a presentation that leaves some blood in the water. So these images put some blood in the water. The image here is my blood in the water, because when I first saw this image by Jack Halberstam, who used to be Judith Halberstam, about female masculinity, I was all hyped about it and very, very much supportive. But then I had a thought. If it had male femininity and my picture was on the cover, would I be as comfortable? And I paused a bit. So for me, even though I talk about these issues, I still have some work to do, and that's my blood in the water. Here is how we can bring the social into this depth psychological conversation. Again, throwing some blood in the water. So what I mentioned earlier, here's my way to throw some of the blood into the water. This is in relationship to Rebecca Solnit, who talks about mansplaining, the subtle way that even educated, thoughtful men participate in patriarchy, and the kind of goddess Saturn shutting down. This one should be self-explanatory. Anti-Blackness not merely as accidental, but structural. So I've gone from the patriarchal to whiteness and the racial. And this is Asherah. If you remember reading Genesis, in Genesis, in the most recent King James Version, there's a reference to we. Well, if you read this excellent book by George and Elena, Elena and Arthur George, called The Myth of Eden, that we refer to the goddess who was erased, who was once known as God's wife, and as Asherah. And this is why I'm sharing that. And it connects it directly back to the Garden of Eden. This is by Marilyn Stone. So what I didn't mention in my description is that the primary fundamental image driving this discussion is that of the rhizome. It is one of Jung's, in my view, most important conceptualization. At the end of his life, he wrote about the rhizome in Memory, Dreams, and Reflections, the quote that I shared with you earlier. And if you look at this very closely, because what's happening here is this is not only a a psychological botanical point, this is a metaphysical point, right? This is very, very important. So I'll get to it, but think about the tree of life and what that stood for in the Garden of Eden, a kind of singular root, and look at the rhizome, right? There is no singular root, right? There is no just the vertical or the horizontal. You can't even tell where it begins and ends. It's about interconnections. It's about networks, right? It's about behaving beyond the expected. And there's no character in literature, American literature, in my view, that embodies that more than the character on my left, Pilate. Listen to the name. Already there you have this like double gesture going on, Pilate. And I'm using her to talk about what I think is important in terms of the rhizome, the kind of work that the rhizome does. And Pilate is connected to the text, Song of Solomon. So before we move forward, I want to make you aware of about 5 concepts that are really informing this talk, but I'm only going to talk deeply about 2 or 3, because after I talk, Dr. Elizabeth Nelson and Loralee Scott have been kind enough to respond to my presentation. And I don't know exactly what they're going to do. And guess what? That's what the rhizome does. It is open to the unexpected, to something that's new, in a way that the rootedness is not. So the rhizome, I've talked about it, it leads to this multiplicity, this third thing. And then there is the arborescent, which is, excuse me a second here. Which is not about multiplicity. It is, again, this image that Jung argues is at the root of everything, the rootedness of everything. So notice it is not a noun, it's a verb, right? And the notion of how the tree of life is this metaphysical assumption and image that drives most of Western civilization, so-called Western imagination. Now let me pause and be clear here. Although the Adam and Eve story is indeed in Islam and in Judaism, they do not take up the story in the same way that mainstream Christianity does, right? In Islam, in a particular version of Islam, the notion of Adam and Eve and God in original sin just does not work. There is no original sin in that. God is loving, God is accepting, et cetera, et cetera. And the same in Judaism with a little bit different twist. So this notion of the fall of human or the fall of man, that is a part of a particular kind of Western mindset. Rhetoric, I've already made a reference to that. Why rhetoric instead of philosophy? And here I'm being provocative, right? We all understand that we have to occupy the tension of opposites, right? That there is no one or the other, right? This goes, the rhizome goes beyond binaries. However, we also understand that we have to occupy the tension of opposites. So I am focusing on this because, and this is nothing new, the emergence of the feminine. several people, Young's referred to it, Guattari and Deleuze have referred to it, it's everywhere. So this is about the imbalance. I do understand that I'm not arguing for kind of one-sidedness. The reason why I choose rhetoric then is that rhetoric, and I talked about this the last meeting, rhetoric is not about the nature of a concept. It is not about the nature of metaphysics. It is about what a concept does in the world, how it embodies itself and circulates in the culture, right? So then it asks a different question, not what is femininity, but what does femininity do in the world? What effects does it have in different places for different people? It's a different kind of question. And another reason why I embrace rhetoric, because rhetoric has been denigrated and has been known as the harlot of the art. In other words, it is feminine to psychology's masculine, okay? Betrayal. Betrayal is central to a rhizomatic relation, to the heretical, right? In terms of betraying convention, conveying the expected. And the character of Pilate, P-I-L-A-T-E, she is free because she is all about betrayal, the wild, the queer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's pause there. You notice that I wrote about Sarah Fuller. Sarah Fuller, of course, was the young lady who who kicked the field goal, who actually engaged in a kick for the first time in a Power 5 conference, the first woman to do it. But now this is when the embodiment comes in. I've noticed that whenever we talk about the feminine, we have to talk about the deep feminine. We have to talk about the shattered feminine, the tortured feminine. Why? It's as if the feminine can't hold all of these at the same time. It can't hold the masculine. It can't hold its own agency. It can't hold its own authority, and it can. And I'm borrowing from queer theory here, right? Because what queer theory has done is taken the word queer, taken it back and said, we embrace the word, we embody the word, and therefore queer means what we think it should mean, right? What we want it to do. Sarah Fuller, on the back of her helmet, had written girl power, right? It's like she's taken this trope and reclaimed it and said, yes, I want to play like a girl and I can still play on this field. So that's what I'm doing there. Meta narratives, I'm not going to say a lot about that. That's a term that I borrowed from Loralee Scott, because she's made a real great point about the importance of meta narratives in our lives and how meta narratives that drive our assumptions about what it means to exist, what it means to be, are so significant that they actually change the composition of our nervous system, of our brains. So these meta narratives then are not just stories, they do all of this kind of work on our bodies and in our world. So Loralee may talk more about that. Excess is a vitally important term, and I'll get back to that a little later. Masking, blackness, and the feminine. Let's address that right now. Throughout women's literature and poetry, there's this notion of the mask. And take note, what I'm talking about here, I'm not arguing that masculinity and blackness are the same. I'm arguing that they intersect in some interesting ways that do not get talked about, right? This is why the rhizome is important. It opens us up to understandings of our own ways of being in the world from other nodes, from other networks of understanding, right? So take note of the hurt, the pain, the tears that feel like rain. You can read through that. My skin is on fire. This notion of the mask is really central to women's understanding, a women's epistemology. And notice how it ends. And care enough so that I can remove it. Is that too much to ask? So now what I'm going to do is switch to an African-American poem that has been famous since it was first published in, I believe, 1859. It is in Obama's referred to it Martin Luther King has referred to it. Mahalia Jackson has referred to it. Maya Angelou has referred to it. And this poem seems as if it was written today, and it's called We Wear the Mask. Can you switch to that?
We could have a real poet read it. Maybe Dennis would read it.
Let Dennis read it. That's fine
Why
with
don't
me.
you read it, Dennis?
And I take umbrage that you saying I'm not a real poet. We don't talk about that.
We'll talk about that one later, brother.
So I've never read it before. Let me just read it out loud and read it for the first time. We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts, we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that the masks we wear are to think about the masks we wear in the form of our personas? Do we wear our personas or not sometime right now? Is our persona to wear a mask or not?
Very well put. And then I think that's something we should definitely talk about. So here you can see this common experience of what it means to hide oneself, what it means to not be able to put one's authority in the world because it's not recognized as authority. So I don't have to say more than that, just kind of take in to how they intersect. But on the other hand, let's make this not too sentimental because not long ago, but it's a classic text that's written by several Black women. And the text was called, All the Women Are White, All the Men Are Black, but some of us are just brave. And it's how Black women, right, and LGBTQ folks get left out of these discussions around race, class, et cetera, et cetera. So while I'm deploying this, I'm doing it in a way, again, that recognizes that there indeed is blood in the water. Song of Solomon. To call it an African-American book is to say yes, but to limit it. To call it an American book is to say yes, but to limit it. It is a book that occupies the African, African-American, and European traditions, the Song of Solomon. And notice the difference here. The difference between Pilate and Icarus is that Pilate could fly without ever leaving the ground. Not all of us can occupy positions of power. Not all of us can want to occupy the rarefied air of the Apollonian, excuse me, right? So, and now, pause. Professor Elizabeth Rasacola had this to say about inclusion. Again, we're bringing blood into the discussion. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Inclusion in the eye of the behead. Do not tell me I am included. I will tell you when I feel included. Okay. Now, again, I included that for the blood and the water, but this isn't about inclusion. This discussion is about, it's about the very structures, right? The very meta narrative that produce the symptoms that we're all wrestling with. So this is more than inclusion. Why is it heretical? Because the rhizomatic resists the tree of life that is rooted, where there is one God and one decision and that Eve is to be punished, and women in the feminine is to be punished because it convinced Adam to disobey. In actuality, the way I perceive it and the way other feminist readers of it perceive it, and again, this book, The Mythology of Eden, is referred to as a necessary sin because it takes us out of paradise, out of utopia, which means both perfect place and no place, and into the world, to wrestle with spirituality on the ground, the way that Pilate does. So it's this awareness of the tension of opposites that isn't necessarily negative, it's also seen as positive. Why is it also heretical and dark and feminine? Here I want to borrow from Carl Jung from the symbols of transformation. The psyche is not of today. Its ancestry goes back millions of years. Individual consciousness is not only the flower and the fruit of a season sprung from the perennial rhizome beneath the earth, right? The psyche would find itself in better accord with the truth if it took the existence of the rhizome in its calculations. Again, for it is the root of all things. And he goes further, and this is why we need to wrestle in the dark, play in the dark the way that Toni Morrison does, play in the margins, play in the wild, because according to Jung and Man Sick, in search of his soul, great innovations never come from above. They most invariably come from below, right? How that taps into darkness. Just as trees never grow from the sky downward, but upward from the earth. So this makes it heretical. It makes it heretical in another way if we want to think about spirituality. That rhizomes then are subterranean, the realm of the dark feminine, right? Playing in the racial, existential, and like the metaphysical dark again. And this is what's important here in terms of if we want to think about mysticism. The rhizomatic is attuned to the subterranean mystical currents that pervade Western religiosity, often running counter to the surface theology. The rhizome, and this is vitally important, lays at the intersection of, the sub-specie attorney, which means the perspective from the eternal. So if the underground, the underworld, the dark, the feminine participates in a perspective from the eternal, okay? Pilate, notice what's going on here. Why is she so important to this discussion? Pilate, as you all know, was the politician that betrayed Jesus, right? He betrayed. Pilate has betrayed racial expectations. She's betrayed gender expectations. She has betrayed the expectation of what it means to work. She's a bootlegger. She's an outlaw. She doesn't even live in a house. She lives in a cave between the landscape and the underground. She embodies all of that that the rhizome entails. But notice what else goes on here. She's a pilot. She can pilot others because indeed she portrays convention. The rhizome opens us up to other possibilities, but those possibilities may scare us to death, i.e. the pandemic, right? So this whole notion of pilot, and who does she pilot? A character named Milkman, who is totally disconnected from his own femininity. So this play on words here, and you know, we depth psychologists love contradictions, right? We love the conflicts of contraries, and this is what's going on here. How do we know that she is a Christ figure? She was born without a navel, right? Born without a navel. And she is so powerful that in the novel, they talk about the notion that men would sleep with And they use the F word, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want to put that much blood on the water yet. And some of my students may be listening, so I'd never live it down. That men would have sex with sheep, goats, animals of all sorts, plants of all sorts, but they would not have it with her. Why? Because as Audre Lorde talks about, she is in control of her own authority, her own eroticism, which is not about pornography, which is not about sex, but it's about being connected to both one's feelings and one's intellect. Having such authority that the men could not even get next to her. They were so afraid. It's an embodied experience, right? And so why is it scary? Because it's not anti-life. Rhizomes are pro-life. And as Dr. Nelson explained in an email to me, which I was going to ask for permission to read, but I'm not asking because I think it's so wonderful. So you'll just have to be mad at me. The roots wander, and yet their urge to life is almost irrepressible. They cannot bloom. They cannot bloom. And yet, isn't a rhizome, a single root, one that is connected deep under earth to every bloom? To me, she argues, that is the real heresy, and argues against the patriarchal notion that we are separate individuals with our own root systems, right? Which is also why the rhizome is an image of radical femininity as a mode of being, equally available to men, women, and the non-binary. Okay. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. So her absence of a navel, her rhizomatic way of being in the world opens her up to people she otherwise might not otherwise open up to. And then it's Toni Morrison's brilliance, and the reason why I wanted to talk about her because she recently passed away. And now here's more blood in the water. The two most dangerous ideas in the Western imagination, according to Toni Morrison, are ideas of beauty and ideas of romantic love. So we can talk about that later. I just read a book on music, and since the 1930s, 93% of the records that have been made around the notion of romantic love. Okay. So as we go to the end of this, get to the end of this, remember I began by saying discomfort. I'm trying to discomfort blood in the water because that's what unlearning occurs. And that's what makes me have to open up myself. Because as David Lynch argued in The Remaking of Man, he argues that sometimes in the quest for wholeness, Jungians allow males to not have to suffer the sickness of the emergence of a new way of being, that we have to wrestle with that. So I'm not arguing against masculinity. There is indeed a productive masculinity. Masculinity becomes negative when masculinity embraces order and organization for its own sake, not for the sake of life. So then the person who has really informed my way of thinking about energy and informing the way I think about the heretical and energy is M. Hester Harding and her book, Psychic Energy, the source of its transformation. I highly recommend it. And notice what happens here, what's going on here. Conflict, change. James Baldwin wrote that any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it. What does this mean for clinicians? And the reason why I'm answering that is my fellow panelist, and I consider a colleague, Selina, always asked that question, what does it mean for clinicians? And there was a time when I was like, I won't even wrestle with that because the question seemed to me to be a put down of those who weren't clinicians. But that's not the way she asked it. She always asked it in a way that's generous. So now that allows me to tell you why I'm playing music. I played music not for entertainment, but at the end of his life, Young accepted into a therapy a woman who was a piano player. And after working with her, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, that from now on, he would never have a session if there were no music involved, right? So this is important because now we recognize for clinicians, if we think about music as excess is important. Why? Because as Zaman argues, excess is not about difference. It's not about others. It is indeed a priori to the norm. Without excess, the norm would have no meaning. Without otherness, the norm would be empty. So indeed, it is a privileging of that which is other, that which is the wild, as Jack Halberstam refers to it in her book around wild things and a disorder of desire. Right? So this becomes very important because now what I'm saying that I think is very important is that women, Black folks, working class males, et cetera, but now we'll go back to Black folks, they know something, that excess is epistemic. So what does that mean in the connection, when one is giving therapy, that indeed it's the excess that these people know something. So that becomes very important. So what I'll end with is this. Indeed, if I've been successful at all, there is blood in the water. The heretical rhizome offers freedom. It offers a third way. And as Young argues, the third way is not achieved by compromise. It is achieved through conflict, through the tension of opposites, and through a lack of compromise. That would be the third way, or what you refer to as the transcendent function. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, it sounded like that Elizabeth and Loralee were going to respond first. Why don't we do that?
Loralee, do you want to go first or shall I? I'll go first. Okay. Vorris, thank you so much for a great thought-provoking presentation. And I don't mind you quoting me my email at all. I think that was great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Mm-hmm. Gosh, there's so many things that I want to respond to, but let me first respond by saying that I completely agree with you about the rhizomatic heresy. That that insight, if you will, that illumination, if you will, happens in the dark. It happens from down below in the depths. It's not, which of course reverses, the spiritual tradition of many hundreds of millions of people, but it arises from below. It is rhizomatic. And the only quibble that I would have with the wonderful statement by James Baldwin is that real change, he says real change implies a breakup of the world as we know it, our familiar world. And I would just change one word there if we're going to be rhetoricians here and pay attention to language and image. I would say real change implies the breakdown of the familiar world. Mm-hmm. And where I take this lesson is from the very first book that I wrote more than 25 years ago and close, almost published. It was close. And it was a very close examination, a deep familiarity with the story of Inanna, and particularly the descent of Inanna. And I know that for all of the mythologists on the panel and in the group tonight, the story of Inanna is probably very familiar. It's a cherished story, and it's an extremely important story because it demonstrates many of the things that you're saying about the rhizomatic heresy. First of all, Inanna is queen of heaven and earth. So she has beauty, you know, she has what we might imagine as romantic love. She's well married, right?
Mhm.
And she does this very bold thing, which few people do, because it takes so much from us. And that is that in the Wolkstein and Kramer translation, she says she opens her ear to the great below. So she makes a choice to go down.
Mhm.
She makes a choice to go to the root, but she is not wholly aware. She's not omniscient. She is not wholly aware of what she's doing. And so her descent, her archetypal descent, requires this radical stripping of every form of honor and power that she has. Okay, so we know this story. She gets to the underworld naked and bowed low. The first thing that her suffering sister does is turn on her the cold eye of death, and she's dead.
Yeah.
She hangs her body on a meat hook, and it rots for 3 days. So this is hardly the fate we would expect of someone who is known for her beauty and her power, the queen of the heaven and earth. What I love best about this story is a small detail that again proves, I think, what you're referring to as this rhizomatic heresy. And I will begin by saying that how I see that playing out in this story is that Inanna is Ereshkigal. She is her dark sister, but she doesn't know it. She has to go down into the blackness and find the blackness, and then she can return. But the important piece for me is that we don't, and Inanna shows this, and there are many, many other myths of descent show this, we don't emerge from the underworld or the great below unchanged. We know that. If we emerge at all, we're going to be changed. But we also emerge with powers that we may not like, that we may not welcome. And one of the powers that Inanna emerges with is the cold eye of death. Her sister's cold, deadly eye, which Sylvia Pereira tells us in her wonderful book about the descent of Inanna, is that highly discriminating ability of the feminine to see things as they really are, to call it like it is. And Inanna emerges from the great below with the cold eye of death, and the consequences are interesting. I'll say that. So that's what I want to say about the rhizomatic heresy. I think, I don't think any of us can be wise until we have blood. That's it. There's that, I'm going to make a categorical statement here. I don't think we can be wise without being bloodied.
So to segue from that, Elizabeth, from we can't be wise until there's blood. First of all, Vorris, thank you for your continued depth and breadth and scholarship and courage to be provocative and to encourage us to go to this blood in the water. And you had asked me to talk a little bit about meta narrative as a follow-up, with where you're going with this. And I think where it's connected to a lot of what you shared and what Elizabeth has been talking about regarding the rhizomatic heresy, I think we have to look more at the meta narratives. And I think we have to understand that meta narratives exist in a similar way to dark matter. I was struck by your image of the tree of life, because when we're looking at the tree, we're looking at something, again, that reaches down into the depths of hell, that goes down into the depths of hell and reaches up into heaven. So while Elizabeth is taking us down, I'm going to take us up to the cosmos metaphorically right now and try to make a comparison to the way in which meta narratives serve a similar function in our psyches as dark matter in the cosmos. And just to give a thumbnail of that, dark matter exists as the organizing force for the large scale structures in the universe. It's the cosmic glue that holds together the dust, the gas, the stars, right? We don't really know still, according to scientists, what dark matter is, because it does not emit or reflect light. It does not even absorb light. So it's not possible for us to directly observe it. The only way we know that it exists is by determining and noticing what it reacts on or with. And with regards to that, the light from the objects behind dark matter, it's warped and it's magnified, and it creates a visual distortion that is known as a lensing effect. So the lensing effect of dark matter. And so I think these meta narratives that we've all lived with and are transgenerationally passed by osmosis, they live in our bones, even when we're not aware of them. You know, they're a way of making meaning. They exist as a psychological dark matter that hold our world and our view of ourselves within that world together. For the most part, they often exist, they're invisible, they're unconscious to a large degree. And they have a lensing effect on us. And I think that's what you're talking about with these rhizomatic heresies, is bringing something into visibility that exists in an invisible realm. I think we can say that meta narratives are the meaning-making prima materia by which we keep at bay the chaos of creative emergence, right? The meta narratives are the meaning-making prima materia by which we keep at bay the chaos of creative emergence. And we are in, I think, a historical moment where there is profound creative emergence that is disruptive and is shifting the tectonic plates at a level of meta narratives that have kept us securely locked into our worldviews and our understanding of who we are in the world and how we function. And I think this goes back to your quote from Baldwin: real change implies the breakup, or in Elizabeth's term, the breakdown of the world. We're not only toppling statues, we're toppling structural meta narratives that, in fact, and some of the newest neurological studies are saying these meta narratives literally structure our neural architecture. Yeah. So when we're talking about changing, it's not as simplistic as, feminism. And I'm going to throw some blood in the water with this statement. The problem with feminism is it's seen as feminine, right? The problem with feminism is it's seen as feminism. It's seen as feminine and not as human. Not as human. If we're going to join together and do this tikkun olam, this repairing of the world, then what's emerging is people like yourself who have the courage and the wisdom and the depth to go to, I think, the depth and to start articulating new lenses of how we see and how we view these meta narratives that, by and large, and I know I'm stereotyping and I know there's exceptions to what I'm about to say, but meta narratives that by and large have given all of us a female self who is disempowered and a masculine self who is desouled. And if we're going to come together to repair the world, then there has to be an embodied embrace, and I'm meaning an embrace by both men and women of an empowered female self and an ensouled masculine self. That is a rearticulation of what power looks like, that understands that it's not simply or only about a hierarchical domination and control, but it's also about a relational ecosystem. And that's where your rhizome, I think, comes in so beautifully, is articulating this relational ecosystem that brings in the dark feminine. We're talking about the dark feminine. We're talking about the empowered feminine that we have to go into the shadows to find, because she's not been allowed entrance into the light of day. And so we all are, men and women, existing and building identities and living within these meaning-making systems that disallows for an empowered female self. And so the mythologies, the psychologies, the theologies, it's not about rewriting the stories. It's about going back and seeing with a different lens, like you've allowed us to do tonight. like allowing us, giving us a bigger, I think a different and a more creative. What's terrifying about that, and what you kept doing tonight, is it's asking us to unlearn, which is so much more difficult than learning, right? It's asking us to break down, to break apart, to hold the tension of creative emergence that can be chaotic and messy and bloody. And then to be able to move forward from that. And I'll leave us with this from Rebecca Solnit. She says this, she says, nonfiction is at its best an act of putting the world back together or tearing some piece of it apart to find what's hidden beneath the assumptions or conventions. And in this sense, creation and destruction can begin again. So Vorris, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Really appreciate it. Before we move on, I would like to add, notice I didn't say respond to, because part of the rhizomatic way of being is to take what you've gotten and work with that, not try to protect what you said earlier. So I'm taking what you've said, and what I want to do is include Black women and women of color in this notion that you talked about in terms of bringing into the light. Because I began with that image of a very, very dark African woman, precisely because quite often in these discussions, they get disappeared by Black men too. And are not seen as sites of epistemology. And I bring this to bear because there's a book and I'm called Seeing Through the Darkness, Black Women in Depth Psychology, which I highly recommend. If one of them are listening, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name, but during a session, one of them talked about how they want to hold on to their anger, how they want to hold on to their rage, because that's much a part of being in the world as a kind of rationality. So I think that's important that we bring that to bear. For example, when Michelle Obama was, when President Obama was first elected, folks had a problem with seeing her as first lady, right? Because Blackness and Black women don't get related to what it is to be a lady, whatever that means, right? And then finally, I'll end here. When I say Black people know something, this is what I mean. So I use Jung to make my point about the eternal. But there are some Black folks who have said something similar. If you think about George Clinton in the parliament, One Nation Under a Groove, where they say, and knowingly, so wide, you can't get around it. So low, you can't get under it. So high, you can't get over it. This is a chance to dance, think, and feel our way out of our constrictions. And that is our understanding of the eternal from down below. I'll leave it there.
That was a really incredible presentation. It was a wow presentation. Thank you. You definitely put blood in the water, 100%. I loved the rhizome image. I loved the interconnectedness of that image. And where it took me, Vorris, was to intergenerational trauma, which Loralee brought up briefly, and which is something that I work with all the time that really isn't given enough definition to. The traumas, and this, goes through every, culture, religion, everything. But a 23-year-old came in. She was sexually abused by her brother. Her mother brought her in because she finally divulged that. Come to find out, when the mother told the father, he opened up and said, yes, I was abused by a priest. Come to find out that his father, the grandfather, was abusing other cousins. Now the young girl is being abused by her boyfriends. So this interconnectedness, this metaphysical connection through the generations is a theme, and how to pull it out by the root. I might not accomplish that. I hope to, but I might not, because the root is so deep, and it could go 10 generations back. We don't know. The only medicine that I know that actually does this is homeopathy. They go back multiple generations to treat constitutionally. Psychology is limited in terms of what we can do. And this, beautiful, beautiful girl, I'm doing my piece to make a difference. The one piece of light is that her father, after holding his sexual abuse from the priest for 40 years, at least that got opened. But this is a slow process psychologically. It really is. And I wanted to thank you for giving me the rhizome. I'd never looked at it from that perspective. So thank you. I'm going to take it into my work even deeper.
Thank you. Appreciate that a lot.
I'd love to jump in now if I'm allowed. Vorris, thank you for lighting up my rhizomic nature. And I've got like 4 bulbs that went off in 4 different ways. And so the amazing ways these 3 women who came before me kind of had a piece to say. I've got kind of 4 things that I just want to drop into the space. First of all, opening up with Gillian Welch, you just, cracked me right open right away. So she's she's like one of my go-to gals. So that was just beautiful. Speaking of music and the power of music. And I do believe that funk music has been put on this earth to teach us how to be humans with each other. So I just love the George Clinton too. I've been thinking a lot about the other and the power of the outsider and the power that the outsider has because it doesn't have the power of the norm or the power of the mainstream. And I come from a family of comedy. And so I think about the importance of how comedians speak truth to power because they are outsiders. And that's their job, right? The jester's job is to speak truth to power. And so I was just thinking about this thing this dance we do in our culture, which is, I don't want to be an other. I don't want to be an outsider. I want to be at the table. And yet, once we're at the table, we don't have the power of the outsider view anymore. So I was just playing with that dance within us that we all do and just was having fun with that. And then you spoke of betrayal. And when I was at Pacifica, Maureen Murdoch had us reenact the hymn of Demeter. And she had us get to step into different archetypes if we wanted to. And I had a big mother complex that I was healing at Pacifica, and Maureen became my mother figure that I was working some of my stuff out with. And so at one point I stood as the archetype of Persephone, and she intuitively stood behind Demeter. And I told her that one of the things that had happened for me as Persephone is that I've have the sovereignty of my own realm now, and a place that she will never be able to enter. And that is the maturation from the maiden to the woman, right? And she looked at me and she said, I understand that, but I will always feel betrayed by it. And I knew in that moment that part of being an adult and all that means, maybe individuation, I don't know what you could stack into that, but part of owning our power and our authority and our sovereignty is knowing we will have to betray those that come before us, even those who love us the most. So that was another little ding for me. And then the last thing was, I've been in dream tending with Stephen Eisenstadt for 2.5 years now. Mm-hmm. And we're really, this rhizomic nature thing, we're like in it. We're shamanically like in it, working it all the time from this perspective. And we've been working with the resonant presence of images and of other who comes in the dream. And I was thinking how beautifully when you talked about, and I can't remember how you made the connection, but that importance of the thinking and the feeling function being together, that in order to be with dream image and figure and to really be in full relationship with it and get its wisdom and its knowledge, the only way you can do that is through rhizomic resonance with image. And so feeling and knowledge are bridged in that moment. And I know for the therapists out there, that mind-body connection, all of that kind of stuff. So that really lit me up in a new way around that. Like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm really seeing and feeling that. So I just want to thank you for throwing the blood in the water tonight and inviting us in to, be baptized in it with you. So thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And let me stick a second with the word resonance. Verl Ehrman has written a wonderful book called Resonance. And in this book, he argues not against rationality, right? But rather that as we go forward, what may be more useful for us is not reason, but resonance. What resonates with what we call reasonable, right? So there's not this easy postmodern dismissal of the truth, which has some real problems. Rather, it is to understand that when we talk about the truth, what resonates with what passes as the truth, depending on who's speaking. So I love the way that you brought up resonance. I think that's vitally important because it taps into affect. And affect is what happens when you when you go into a room and someone's been arguing and you can feel, right? It goes between bodies, through bodies, around bodies. So it pushes against this notion of individualism.
Yeah.
Not that they're not subjects, not that they're not persons, but this notion of the individual that is really grounded in kind of like Democritus and this notion of atomistic thinking still kind of influences that. And that's the problem. Human beings aren't, it's relational in that sort of way. So I like the fact you talked about resonance because it's vitally important. And I do want to say, right, in terms of resonance and truth, I didn't mention, here's the issue. I talked about Jung, but in academic circles, they don't talk about Jung in the rhizome. They talk about Deleuze and Guattari, schizophrenia and capitalism, right? The Thousand Plateaus, without ever making a reference to Jung, who talked about it before they did, right? So you have these academics, whom I love because I'm part of them, but it's like there is this kind of, it's not rhizomatic, it's very much discipline oriented.
If I can join in, I think in this line between the feminine and the masculine. Vorris, I enjoyed the presentation, wonderful, and you actually hinted to the point that the Quranic version of the Adam and Eve story is different than the biblical. And yes, oftentimes because we share the names, they are lumped together. I think a more significant difference is that the Quran does not have an Eve. There is only Adam, and Adam is androgynous. And Adam has a spouse, and the spouse is described in the masculine gender as that applies both to masculine and feminine. And so that's one thing. The second thing is that I often talk about the three creations of Adam. And this third one that's relevant to our discussion here, which is when Adam, that Adam creates itself with the help of the divine, through that dialogue of the forbidden fruit, that the tree in the Quran that they were not supposed to approach. And after Adam and its spouse approached the tree, and they are found to have violated the rules, the divine power asks, kind of raises this question, like, how come, why did you do what you were not supposed to do? So Adam and its spouse respond in the Arabic dual, not plural, not singular, but in the dual form, that we did it unto ourselves. And we can't do a thing without you forgiving us. So this is sort of the direct dialogue that the Quran speaks about, but then there is an aside. And in the aside, God turns to Adam and says, like, didn't you know that it wasn't you were doing? And Adam says, of course I did. It couldn't have been my doing, it was your doing, but because I loved you so much, because of that love, I had to take responsibility, even though it was you who did it, which is the exact relationship in a love, love relationship. So when the divine becomes the divine beloved for the Sufis, for the Muslims, is that idea that for the divine beloved, you would do anything, not because it's right, not because it's wrong, but because your love demands it. And so in that sense, then the divine beloved understands and says, now that you acknowledged your love to me, I will return that love. And so in a way, what in the biblical narrative is often referred to as the fall is in the Quranic language as in reality a reward. It's God rewarding Adam and its spouse for taking a responsibility for something that was not their doing, but they did it out of love. And so this is, there's not only the element of original sin that is missing, but that action is interpreted as a reward because they did something out of love, and God in a way appreciates that and and returns that love by, in essence, elevating them. Yes, they there's a kind of a fall, but perhaps that's where the English language expression comes very, very handy. They fall in love, out of love, and for love. Thank you.
No, thank you. Before you go, do you have a book outside of the Quran, et cetera, that I could read about the notions you just shared? You can email it to me or tell me now.
Well, I could email it or female it. The only problem is I haven't published it yet. So I'm speaking from my notes primarily, but I do go directly to the Quran, and oftentimes, you go to the Muslim culture, Eve is a very popular name. And when you ask them, they say, oh yeah, of course it's a Quranic name. And you tell them where in the Quran? They say, well, it's somewhere in there, but it's not anywhere in there. So I think it probably had to do with the mass conversion of Jews and Christians in the early Islamic period, that they brought the biblical culture with them. And if they heard the name that was so similar to what they were used to in the biblical context, they accept that, well, then all the rest of the story and the rest of the narrative must also be the same. And they bought it. So in the Islamic culture, the view is not very different from the Christian biblical culture. Whereas in the Quranic text, it's a I can't say it's totally different, but it's different in the most essential ways. like not having the burden of the feminine being responsible for the original sin and all the rest of it, or that the feminine was created from the rib and all that. None of that is there. And as you said, of course, there's no original sin either.
You know, can I jump in, or Vorris? I don't want to stop if you want to comment on Zaman.
Go ahead.
Really a wonderful, you know, you can tell by the quality of the observations and the comments, insights from the panel, how deeply you stirred things up. Two things were circling for me as I listened to you. One is the nature of freedom itself, and the other is myth making. And when I read this Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination in 1992, when it came out, essays, talks by Toni Morrison that were put together, this passage really circled around your presentation, and I want to read it to you and ask you to make any observation connecting analogically what Toni Morrison says here with what you were presenting tonight. She writes, "There is no romance free of what Herman Melville called the power of blackness, especially not in a country in which there was a resident population already black upon which the imagination could play, through which historical, moral, metaphysical, social fears, problems, and dichotomies could be articulated. The slave population, it could be and was assumed, and this is so fascinating, offered itself up as a surrogate self for meditation on problems of human freedom. It's almost as if the white imagination needed blackness in order to be able to define its own sense of not being enslaved. I mean, the irony there is just so rich. Let me just take it a tad further, Vorris, and then please respond. This black population was available for meditations on terror, the terror of European outcasts, their dread of failure, their dread of being powerless, nature without limits, natal loneliness, internal aggression, evil, sin, greed. In other words, Morrison writes, this slave population was understood to have offered itself up. It's a sacrificial people for reflection on human freedom in terms other than the abstractions of human potential and the rights of man. And then I'll finish with this. The ways in which artists and the society that bred them transferred internal conflicts to a blank darkness, and she puts those two words in quotes, to conveniently bound and violently silenced Black bodies. It's a major theme in American literature. The rights of man, and here's the myth-making part that I was hearing in your presentation. The rights of man, for example, serving as an organizing principle upon which the nation was founded, was inevitably yoked to Africanism, its history and its origin. And then finally, the concept of freedom did not emerge in a vacuum. Nothing highlighted freedom if it did not in fact create it, like slavery. So that's the myth-making piece that I also heard in your presentation. So I find the deep irony of the white imagination, as Morrison understood it, and understood it, as needing darkness and blackness in order for them to be freed of their own enslavement, of terror, of inadequacy. Are we going to make it? We're a young country, we're vulnerable. So that's part of what your talk spurred, that passage. And any observations you'd like to make would be great.
Sure. Like with Zaman, if you didn't ask me, I wouldn't have made a comment, because sometimes I think, again, keeping with this rhizomatic aesthetic, that I get moved too. And so my speaking on it may get in the way of the kind of work it did coming from Zaman or coming from, so Zaman, what you said moved me deeply. So I don't want you to read it as if I'm kind of about to respond to it. It's like, you said it needs to be said that way, fine. So that's why I didn't. I'm glad you brought that up, right? Because now you help, Dennis, you're helping me to make more clear what you just argued and what Toni Morrison argued is exactly what I meant by the notion of excess. The way I described it may have been too conceptual or too philosophical, right? So to take up Toni Morrison, James Hillman in Dream in the Underworld puts it another way, that Black folks become nothing but the projection of whites in ways that it can't be reversed the other way. So all we are our projections. So let me say it another way. If you think about Enlightenment humanism, whether it's Hegel, whether it's Jefferson, et cetera, these otherwise bright, thoughtful folk, they could not envision Enlightenment humanism without anti-Blackness. It doesn't exist without it. It is central to it. It is not accidental.
Right.
So Elizabeth, what's the name of the, you shared that article with me, the professor who was talking about capitalism now, what's her name? Do you remember?
Oh, Mazzucato. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing her name. Yeah. She's just published a wonderful book, and she was featured in Time magazine. Mariana Mazzucato.
Thank you.
Yes.
And what she argues, right, and this is from the gender perspective, that the oppression of women's labor, of domestic labor, is not incidental to capitalism. Capitalism depends upon it, right? It is not incidental, it's structural in that way. And so to take it back to race, that is what Toni Morrison is getting at. And let me bring this back into reality to give a sense. So when people talk about anti-Blackness as being structural, or there's this argument about Afro-pessimism, that Black folks have no ontology, because ontology depends upon its exclusion. Now, there are a lot of Black folks who don't agree with that, but there are some who do. So how does that work itself out in our world? And I hope this isn't abstract. When the corporate form was first developed and moved to the United States, it wasn't natural. They tried to figure out how could they gain more power. The way they did it is out of the first, and if you watch this wonderful documentary called The Corporation, it's discussed. The way they did it is, out of the first 339 decisions around the 13th Amendment, or that was supposed to be about Black people as human, 319 of them were used for corporations. The corporations argued that they were human based on Black slavery. So even there, the corporate form is racialized. So that's what they're getting at. Now, let's understand, the reason why I said the rhizomatic is so important, because none of these conceptions are totally closed. They're escape hatches. There are ways that people get out of it. So when you talk about freedom, that's vitally important. And so again, I'm glad you brought that out. This isn't about making white folks evil, making black folks innocent. It's not about that. It's about something that's far more conceptual. And I'll end with this. In my class, let's talk about the attraction and the attraction and the rejection of blackness. When I'm in my classrooms, I'll ask my students, have you ever been to a club or outside where someone has touched your hair? And I ask my white students that, and maybe 2, 3, 4% will do it. But my black students, whether they're from the United States or diasporic from Haiti, always over 90% of them talk about some person reaching out, touching their hair, and that person is usually white. Now, think about it this way. This is why Sylvia Wynter, in an excellent book, argues that Black folks are not human, because the notion of human is based upon, she argues, the denial of Blackness is human. So let me end it with this. And this has happened to me, someone touching my hair. When I'm in public and someone has a dog, I ask permission to touch and to pet the dog. To touch someone's hair without their permission is to treat them as being less than human. So Toni Morrison gets at this in some really thoughtful ways. And that was a brave, courageous woman.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Vorris.
Wonderful.
I just wanted to add that the reference you're asking me for, Vorris, I have. One of them would be the Mythosophia presentation. I think it's number 4 that Will knows. And then there is another one, which is a YouTube video. It's all my YouTube videos start with my last name, Stanizai. So it's Stanizai, then an archetypal Adam with no Eve.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you want to kind of document it in a way that I won't go back on my words, you could probably go there.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
Actually, Vorris, I was wanting to build on a few of the things people have said. One part of what Zaman's talking about with Eve, what Loralee is bringing in with the meta narrative, and especially what you're talking about with the rhizome. The rhizome, of course, is that, as you describe, it's the pattern below that becomes the pattern above. And by the way, the other triple entendre for Pilate is, of course, the Pilate light, the light below.
That's
light.
right. Yeah.
It's very cool. But beyond just the positive rhizomatic notions of the repressed feminine and its pattern coming forward, I wanted to take a minute to continue to deconstruct the negative patterns, the negative rhizomatic patterns that are actually ongoing prisons. And when I was in college, I was a philosophy major. I was studying world religions, and nobody ever took the time to explain to me. I'm like, Socrates, this seems really similar to Hindu notion of cleaning the soul, whatever. Nobody took the time to ever say to me, asceticism. It took me, I had to get past my whole major to get to a place where I could learn this, and I had to make all the connections myself before I found asceticism. And asceticism is this idea, for those who are maybe less familiar with it, that it's built around a certain metaphysic, that the soul or the spirit is imprisoned in the body, and that the body, with its senses, demands for you to do things that feel good or that don't feel bad. And so sometimes we make rationalizations. Oh, I want that chocolate. Oh, I want to have sex with that person, whatever. And then we end up contorting our philosophies around our body's motivations. And so you might say that your reasons become your reasoning. Your reason becomes your reason, right? And so I think that this ascetic idea that you see in Eve, the fallen soul into the world, the fallen world. And who is it that made us fall? Both Satan and Eve are the seducers that represent materiality. So the same word, mater, is mother and matter. And so one of the things I want to suggest is one of the really damaging rhizomes is the infinite reductive association of the feminine with the material. because the Western world is in the Western mind has been in any ascetic tradition, from Pythagoreanism to certain Hindu traditions, right? Parts of Hinduism. Material is often presented as that which corrupts. The body is presented as that which corrupts. And so once you start to conflate the feminine with the material and with the body, as seen in Eve, as seen in Pandora, you are setting up, invariably, cannot avoid it, the objectification of women.
Mm-hmm.
It's built into the rhizome.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's one of the things that I really hope that we'll all kind of look at and consider is, where is this rhizomatic objectification? And I think that's one of the main places we look at it. And one of the things I wanted to bring up is because anytime that idea, that philosophy of the spirit being corrupted by the body, and there's actually some parts of it that are incredibly convincing, and the connection of the feminine to the material, there are parts of that that are incredibly relevant and reasonable too when it doesn't get reductive. So I always want to, whenever bringing this up, jump right to the end and point to the Buddha's solution to this, which is that middle way, sitting in the center of the universe, and Mara is like, how dare you sit in the center of the universe? And what does the Buddha do? He reaches down, he touches the earth trembles as if to say he has every right to be here. But why does he have every right to be there? Because he's touching the earth, because he's chosen the middle way, because he's drank the milk, he's eating the rice, because he's recognized that it's not just about asceticism. And so I think that that's something that we could really do well to deconstruct in our own culture. It comes from our Christianity. It comes from our Western philosophical tradition, grounded in Plato and the Pythagoreans and all these, all kinds of ascetic traditions. So I know you're familiar with a lot of this argument, and just wanted to bring a little bit of it onto the table before we end it tonight.
Yes, I'm familiar, and you make valid points. Where I think I took up that implicitly, your concern, which obscures or mediates this objectification of feminine and thereby women, is when I argued that excess, which I equate with the feminine, with blackness, is epistemological. I said that the feminine, it knows things. Difference knows things. A philosopher, I forget who said it, you might remember, who said that the way to the soul is through otherness. So it goes back to this notion of I, thou. So when I talk about epistemology, and I didn't go too far, and as you know, that means knowledge producing, knowledge manufacturing. That is my way of resisting this kind of objectification of women in matter. That said, I think you bring up an important issue that needs to be on the table in these kind of discussions.
Thank you. Yeah, that the reduction to material is, I think, one of the things that happens there is we also separate mind and body. And as we separate mind and body, we're separating consciousness and matter, which leads to the deconsciousness of matter, which leads to the, seeing matter as dead. And as long as you conflate matter with mater, with the mother, and as long as you see material as dead, but what you're talking about is with the excess, with knowing, you're putting knowing and you're putting flowing back into the material, unkilling the material. And I think that's where we're at right now. I think we've got to unkill the material.
Yes.
And as you know, it's not only women that have been connected to, or femininity that's been connected with material, darkness. Once it turns to a battle of light versus dark, when it's mind versus body becomes light versus dark, as it has in Manichaeism and all these other traditions, now you've turned it into a white versus black setup in the mind as well. So both blackness and femininity suffer from the conflations of asceticism with darkness and material.
Yeah, I feel you. I think you make a very valid point. What I want to add, not to respond just to you, but in terms of something I want to get said, is that, look, it's pretty clear that talking about race and queerness and sexual orientation and ethnicity and feminine, I have no problem doing that. But let me be clear about something that may or may not make me differentiate me from some folks. Race you can't explain anything without race, ethnicity, class, etc. But that doesn't explain everything. And who did I borrow that from? From Octavia Butler, who's won a Genius Award, who's written gorgeous books, Parable of the Sword, for example, where you have a woman, a female who is androgynous, who founds a religion. And Octavia Butler says, and I quote, and this is why I brought up a third way. She says, I assume my blackness, I assume my gayness, I assume my womanness. I'm on to something else. So I'm on to something else. But I can't get to that if we can't assume these other ways of being and knowing are central to going somewhere else. And that's why this third way that Jung talks about is so important, because the notion of no compromise, we can discuss, we can banter back and forth, but around certain issues, in order to do something else, to be involved in the rhizomatic heretical, or the heretical rhizomatic, to get to something else means we have to know exactly where we stand, whether that is certain or uncertain. So I'm having these discussions, and the reason why I can embrace Jung is because I'm on to something else. And I think Jung was on to something else, despite his limitations, right? Another way to say this is, I have folks who will say to me, well, why don't you be on race? And my answer to that is, and they said to get to the human. And my position is, you can't understand a human, and if you don't understand the feminine, if you don't understand blackness, if you don't understand Persianness, I mean, and I'll end with this. Toni Morrison said it best. When you have a number of Black folks who in presentations will say, I'm Black, but I'm mixed with A, B, and C. Toni Morrison never did that, because she said, in her view, Blackness can take up and possess everything. So when she says I'm Black, that means everything. All right. All right. And when she says I'm a woman, that means everything. She doesn't have to qualify it.
Thanks, Vorris. And I think I saw Kelly maybe has another thought just before we go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I was thinking about what you just said, Will. Both of you were talking about this matter and material and all of that. And I was once again came back to the word resonance. And then in order to be able to resonate, you have to have a body. You have to have material. So, and that is then when you tap into the knowledge. So I just wanted to, I was like, oh, they're bringing it all together for me. So thank you.
Yeah, and Kelly, thank you. And Vorris, that what Will was talking, you threw this little one in there and it exploded for me. Intellect and intimacy, that I think also speaks to this, right? Because in the biblical Hebrew, they use the word to know, meaning the actual act of physical lovemaking. The verb that was used for that is to know. He knew her. She knew him. So somewhere we've lost that conjunctio of intellect and intimacy. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot more there. I think that's a really huge theme. So thank you for introducing that.
If I can throw in that in the Sufi terminology, the word suhba also initially meant that. However, they have, I don't know if I can use the word desexualized it. Mm. And so now when you use the word suhba, it means having conversation with someone instead of the closer intimacy that it was meant to be initially.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Vorris, thank you so much for saying yes to all of the things that I have asked you over the years. You've become a a very cherished and wonderful friend. And like a lot of the things that I feel grateful for, it's when I put myself out there and ask somebody to say yes, and they say yes. I'm touched by how far Will and I have come in our relationship with what started in my family room with a series of gatherings that ultimately it broke down because of the coronavirus. We couldn't do it. And we went to Chris Vogler and said, would you come play with us online? And we didn't know whether it would work or how it would work. But I'm struck by when you get two people doing something together, something comes out of it. And there's that third thing. And when you get 9 people, you get this thing that grows beyond the 9 of us. And you get the 100 people who are sitting here watching and enjoying and filling the chat box with it. And then you get a community of people, and it resonates throughout it as part of the fiber of being. And everybody who is part of it wants more of it because it feeds the soul. And when the mind tries to figure out what makes it work, the heart says it doesn't matter. Be here now. Enjoy this. I'm thinking of my readings with Jonathan, and I've been completely transformed by his coming into my life 2 or 3 weeks ago, hardly. And we put 20 of these Tao Te Ching videos up online. Every one of them is a piece of magic. It's soul work. Mm-hmm. And each one of them has a different tenor and moves down through any of the infinite paths that the Tao can take us. And so with that in mind, what I would like to do is, Will and I have approached one another with the idea that on December 17th, which is 2 weeks from tonight, we want to invite everyone who's willing to come into the panel and extend the panel from 9 to 25 to 50 or whatever it happens to be, if you'll say something, if you'll come with a story, come with something you've written, something that you can show, something of yourself. Because I want to be affected by you. And I want all of us to be affected by one another. Because this is what makes community. This is what makes everything. Elizabeth will remember years ago, before all of this started, we had a bring your own fish party at my house. And this thing went on for hours. And the fish at the beginning of the dinner was different than the fish at the end of the dinner. And it was like a bouillabaisse or a cioppino or something like that. And if we could congregate, I'd do the same thing today. Because I think community wants that rhizome. It wants the sharing. It wants the changing of oneself into another. It doesn't want the divisions. Mm-hmm. So, Vorris, I'm touched by your presentation. We have had such wonderful comments. I love everyone here. And I hope you'll respond when we send out the notice for December 17th, and let's play. Let's come in. In closing, what I'd like to do is have a moment of silence for since this started, I just went online. we've lost about another 100 people in the time it took us to do this myth salon. Those are not statistics, those are actual human beings, you know, and they weren't looking to die. They weren't looking to go to the hospital. They weren't looking to have something inconvenient or having their lives stop, but lives, when one life stops, they all stop, and there's a hole in somebody's life where that person used to be. So just a brief moment of silence, please. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you everyone for coming in. Vorris, Will, Selina, Dennis, Loralee. Loralee, thank you for coming all the way from North Carolina. It's cold back there. It was 28 degrees. My friend wrote me, he was there today, and Elizabeth, Zaman, and Kelly, I hope you'll come back and play with us. You know, I love you, you know? Thank you all.
Thank you, panelists. Love the questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Vorris.
You all make it much better. Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Take care.
Good night.
Good night,
Good night,
everyone.
Zaman.
Guys,
Good night, Kelly.
thank you.
Appreciate it.
See you,
Thanks,
brothers.
Selina.
Bye-bye.